Welcome, esteemed listener. Today I invite you to travel through time with me. Let's journey together to a land of ancient olive trees, where the wind carries the scent of ripe wheat and the secrets of the human heart are slowly unveiled, like flowers blossoming under the Andalusian sun. This is a story about a woman who was discarded like a dry leaf to the wind, yet, in her apparent fragility, held the strength of ancient roots. A story about a man who confused heirs with inheritances and had to lose everything to understand that true legacy is not planted in lands, but in souls. Have you ever loved someone who failed to recognize your worth? Have you been judged for something you could not control? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself from your own rubble? If you answered yes to any of these questions, this narrative was written for you. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Which city, which corner of the world did your hands find this tale? Leave it in the comments. I love knowing which lands these stories travel through. And if this journey touches your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Every gesture allows me to continue bringing stories that span centuries to remind us of eternal truths. Now, settle in, take a deep breath. Let the present fade for a few moments. The setting year 1796, southern Spain, the region of Andalusia, Mendoza estate and the village of San Cristobal. In an era when women's destinies were charted by the hands of others, in a land where a family name weighed more than a heart, a young woman named Esperanza dared to believe that love could blossom even in the most arid lands. This is her story. The man and the arrangement. The Mendoza estate's olive groves stretched as far as the eye could see, their centuries-old trees bent under the weight of generations of secrets and hopes. It was on that land, between golden hills of wheat and ancient oak forests, that Rodrigo Mendoza learned to be a man, not in the soft manner that books describe, but in the harsh way that life imposes on those born with a name, but without fortune. At 29, when his father breathed his last on a bed that smelled of sour wine and shame, Rodrigo inherited not prosperous lands, but a tangle of debts woven by the trembling hand of an inveterate gambler. Creditors arrived even before the earth on the grave settled, and for 5 years, while other men his age courted maidens in illuminated ballrooms, Rodrigo bent his back to the sun, sweated alongside his workers, and wrested from the land everything his father had denied him: dignity. By age 34, the Mendoza estate was again shining. The vineyards produced grapes that turned into wines, sought after by Seville's merchants. The oil from his olive trees was considered the purest in the region, and Rodrigo, with his black hair falling to his shoulders and a trimmed beard framing a face marked by labor, was seen as the example of what a true man could achieve. But there was an emptiness. Sitting in his office one autumn afternoon, Rodrigo watched the letter tremble slightly in his hands. His mother, Doña Elvira's handwriting was precise as ever, every word calculated to wound with the elegance of one wielding silk daggers. "A man without heirs is a tree without fruit," she had written. "And fruitless trees are cut down, my son. You have reconquered your father's lands, but what good are lands without someone to inherit them? I have found a solution for you. The Delgados have a respectable name and a daughter of marrying age. The father is an impoverished farmer who will accept any deal. The girl is named Esperanza." Rodrigo placed the letter on the table and walked to the window. Outside, Don Bernardo Salazar, his trusted administrator, supervised the olive harvest. At 62, with his white hair and long beard giving him the air of a biblical prophet, Don Bernardo had served the Mendoza family for 3.5 decades. It was he who taught Rodrigo that the earth does not lie, that it returns exactly what is planted in it. But women were not lands, and marriages were not harvests. Yet the logic was irrefutable. Rodrigo needed an heir. The Delgado family needed land. The arrangement would be advantageous to both. Thus, 3 weeks later, Rodrigo found himself before the modest home of the Delgado family in the village of San Cristobal. The 2-hour walk from the estate had given him time to rehearse words he never needed to utter. Esperanza's father, Don Geronimo, was a bitter man who saw his daughter merely as a bargaining chip, and he accepted the terms before Rodrigo had finished presenting them. She was in the garden when he saw her for the first time. Esperanza Delgado was 19, and her dark brown wavy hair fell to her waist like a cascade of dark honey. Her eyes, the color of amber when the light passed through them, lifted from the herb patch where her delicate hands were working and met his. There were no words in that first moment, only a gaze that lasted the time of a breath, but which Rodrigo would remember for all the years that followed. She did not smile. She did not lower her eyes with the expected shyness of a promised bride. She simply held his gaze with a silent dignity that profoundly disconcerted him. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the church of San Cristobal. Esperanza wore a dress that had belonged to her grandmother, a crude cotton fabric with wildflower embroidery on the bodice, and on her neck she wore a small silver locket containing dried herbs. When Rodrigo asked about the locket later, already in the carriage taking them to the estate, she replied with the soft voice that he would learn to recognize as her true nature. "My grandmother taught me about the plants that heal. This locket contains rosemary for memory and lavender for peace. She used to say that a woman who knows herbs is never truly alone." The first months were softer than Rodrigo dared to hope. Esperanza adapted to the large house with a natural grace that won over the servants one by one. She knew everyone's names within a few weeks, asked about their families, and soon transformed a corner of the garden into a small medicinal herb patch where she spent her mornings. Rodrigo watched her sometimes from his office window as she talked to the plants as if they were old friends, and something in his chest, long dormant, began to awaken. One winter evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the rain tapped on the windows, Esperanza sat beside him on the sofa, and without a word, rested her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. That perhaps this arrangement was the first step toward something real. Rodrigo did not answer. He merely wrapped his arm around her and let the silence say what his words did not know how to express. But time, like the seasons, does not stand still, and there was a shadow approaching that neither of them could see, a shadow that would test not only their marriage, but the very essence of who they were. For at some point, between the months that turned into years, the hope her name carried would begin to wither like a plant deprived of water. And when that happened, Rodrigo Mendoza would discover that reconquering lands is infinitely easier than reconquering a heart. The shadow of barrenness. 3 years, 36 moons, 1,095 sunrises. That was how Esperanza counted the time since her wedding, in natural cycles, as her grandmother had taught her. Each new moon brought a silent prayer. Each full moon, a disillusionment that she swallowed with the dignity of one who learned early that crying does not change destiny. Her womb remained empty. Rumors began to circulate through the estate like poison diluted in clean water, imperceptible at first, but gradually contaminating everything they touched. The maids lowered their eyes when she passed. The field workers exchanged glances she pretended not to see, and during monthly visits to the village of San Cristobal, the church women whispered behind their fans with a cruelty that only respectability can disguise. "Barren," they said. "Cursed," they murmured. "He should have chosen better," they concluded. Esperanza heard everything. Each word was a small knife lodging itself in her flesh, and at night, when Rodrigo was already asleep, increasingly often in the room next door, she allowed the tears to run freely, soaking the goose-feather pillow that was softer than anything she had known in her previous life. But it was the arrival of Doña Elvira that turned suspicions into certainties. Rodrigo's mother was a woman of 60, whose upright posture defied age, and whose black eyes carried the chill of winters that never end. She lived in Seville, in an elegant house maintained by the money she extracted from her son under the pretext of maintaining her status, and her visits to the estate were rare, but devastating. "You look tired," Doña Elvira said on the first night, as the 3 generations sat at the dinner table. Her eyes scanned Esperanza's body with the precision of a merchant evaluating damaged goods. "I imagine caring for such a large estate is exhausting for someone of your origin." "You are very kind in your concern," Esperanza replied, her voice level. "But I find great joy in my responsibilities." "Joy." Doña Elvira sipped her wine with deliberate slowness. "What an interesting choice of word. My son does not seem particularly joyful lately. I wonder why." Rodrigo remained silent. That silence hurt more than any word his mother-in-law could have uttered. The weeks that followed were a slow decay. Doña Elvira found increasingly sophisticated ways to undermine Esperanza's position, questioning her domestic decisions, criticizing her simple clothes, constantly reminding her of her humble origin, and Rodrigo, consumed by an anxiety he did not fully understand, began to withdraw. One spring afternoon, he brought a doctor from Seville. Doctor Esteban was a corpulent man with hands that smelled of alcohol and a gaze that made Esperanza feel like an animal being examined in the marketplace. The examination was humiliating. The questions, invasive, and the diagnosis, pronounced before Rodrigo and his mother as if Esperanza were not present, was devastating. The problem clearly lies with the wife. There are deficiencies in her constitution that prevent conception. I regret to inform you that the chances of an heir are minimal. Esperanza wanted to scream that she bled every month, that her body functioned as it should, that perhaps, just perhaps, the problem lay elsewhere. But women of her time did not question doctors. Women of her time accepted the verdict in silence. That night she tried to use her grandmother's knowledge. She prepared teas of nettle and raspberry leaves. She made compresses of mugwort. She prayed to the saints and the ancient forces of the earth that her grandmother secretly revered. But the months passed, and her womb remained as empty as the bed she now occupied alone. Rodrigo had moved to the adjacent room 6 months ago. First, it was excuses about his restless sleep disturbing her rest. Then work that kept him up late. Finally, there were no excuses, just the sound of footsteps passing her door without stopping, and the deafening silence of an absence that hurt more than any presence. Don Bernardo was the only one who noticed. One autumn afternoon, he found Esperanza in the herb garden, kneeling among the patches with her hands buried in the soil, as if seeking some kind of anchor there. "Madam," he said, approaching with the caution of one who knows wounds that should not be touched, "the gardener can take care of this." "The earth does not judge," she replied without looking up. "The earth only receives and returns." Sometimes it is the only honesty I find in this house. The old administrator knelt beside her, ignoring his protesting joints. "I have known Rodrigo since he was a 5-year-old boy, afraid of thunderstorms. What he is doing is not about you. It is about his father's ghost, his mother's demands and fears he never learned to name. But that does not make his actions any less cruel." Esperanza finally faced him. Her honey-colored eyes were dry. She no longer had tears to waste. "Do you think he can still change?" Don Bernardo thought for a long moment before answering. "I think every man carries within him the possibility of being better than he is. But I also know that sometimes one has to lose everything to find that possibility." She looked back at the plants, her hands caressing the green leaves as if they were old friends. "My grandmother used to say that the most powerful herbs are those that grow in the most difficult conditions, that adversity is what transforms a common plant into medicine. Wise woman, your grandmother. She survived things that would break men twice her size. And she never lost her tenderness." Don Bernardo stood up, extending his hand to help her. "Then perhaps you inherited more than knowledge of herbs." Esperanza accepted the help and stood up, shaking the dirt from her skirts. Inside the house, she could see Doña Elvira's silhouette in the window, watching them with that calculating gaze that seemed to measure every second of vulnerability. "You know what is being planned, don't you?" Don Bernardo's silence was answer enough. That night, while the house slept, Esperanza remained awake, listening to the sounds of the estate, the wind in the olive trees, the distant barking of guard dogs, the chirping of crickets. At some point, she made a decision. No matter what came next, no matter what they did to her, she would not lose her dignity. Her grandmother had not raised her to break. She was Esperanza Delgado, and her name, which meant hope, would be more than an empty word. But what she did not know, what none of them knew, was that at that exact moment something had already changed, something too small to be noticed, but powerful enough to alter the course of all their lives. And when that truth finally came to light, it would be too late to avoid the devastation that was approaching. The burned letter. The documents arrived on a September afternoon, when the air still carried the weight of summer, and the grapes in the vineyards were beginning to ripen for the harvest. Father Alfonso was a small man, with hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from the weight of what he carried. He found Esperanza in the herb garden, as was her custom at that hour of the day, and handed her the envelope sealed with red wax, unable to look her in the eyes. "Señora Mendoza, I deeply regret this." She did not need to open the envelope to know what it contained. For weeks she had felt the storm approaching, in the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, in the looks exchanged between Doña Elvira and Rodrigo, in the increasingly dense silence that filled the spaces where there had been, at least, the illusion of normality. Even so, her hands did not tremble as she broke the seal. "Request for matrimonial annulment," the heading read. And below, in bureaucratic script that turned the destruction of a life into a mere administrative procedure, reason, non-consummation of the marriage. It was a lie, of course, a lie that Rodrigo had allowed to be recorded to facilitate the process, to avoid the scandal of a divorce due to infertility, to protect whom exactly? Certainly not her. "You may inform Don Rodrigo," said Esperanza, her voice so calm it surprised even herself, "that I would like to speak with him tonight." "In the office." Father Alfonso swallowed hard and nodded, clearly relieved to escape the situation. Esperanza remained in the garden for another hour, her hands working mechanically among the herbs, while her mind processed the magnitude of what was happening. She would be expelled, returned to her family as damaged goods, and she would carry for the rest of her days the stigma of a repudiated woman, unable to fulfill the only function that society considered worthy of her sex. But it was not the humiliation that hurt her most deeply. It was the memory of that winter night, just over 3 years ago, when she had rested her head on his shoulder and allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, that arranged agreement could turn into something real. That night, when the house was already enveloped in silence, Esperanza walked to Rodrigo's office. He was sitting behind the desk, illuminated by the flickering light of a candelabrum, and did not look up when she entered. "I read the documents," she said. "Then you know what you need to know. Look at me." Something in her tone made him lift his head, and when their eyes met, Esperanza saw something there that surprised her. Not triumph, not indifference, but something that looked terribly like shame. "Why a lie?" she asked. "If you want to get rid of me, why not simply tell the truth? The truth does not matter. The result is the same. The truth always matters." She took a step forward. "Rodrigo, I know these last few years have been difficult. I know you carry fears you cannot name, but we could have faced this together. We could have—" "Faced what?" He finally stood up, and there was something wild in his eyes that she had never seen before. "The certainty that everything I worked for will disappear, that when I leave this earth there will be no one to continue what I built. My father destroyed everything. I rebuilt. And now you are destroying something else, something that cannot be rebuilt with work and sweat. I need an heir." His voice was flat, as if reciting a mathematical fact. "You cannot give me one. That is simply it." Esperanza felt every word like a cold blade passing through her chest, but she did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She stood upright before him with all the dignity her grandmother had taught her. "You are right," she said at last. "That is simply it. That is all I am to you. An empty womb. Not the woman who cared for your workers when they were sick. Not the woman who turned this house into a place of warmth and welcome. Not the woman who loved you despite everything. Just an empty womb." Rodrigo looked away. "The documents will be processed in 8 weeks. You may take your personal belongings. I will arrange a sum for—" "I do not want your money." "Esperanza." "No." She raised her hand and he fell silent. "You have renounced the right to use my name with intimacy. From now on, I am merely the woman you discarded. And when the consequences of that decision reach you, because they will, Rodrigo, they always do, remember this moment. Remember that I offered my hand and you refused it." She turned and walked to the door. Before leaving, she looked over her shoulder one last time. "My grandmother used to say that the most foolish men are those who confuse the value of things, who exchange diamonds for glass stones because the glass shines brighter in the sun. You have just done exactly that." The door closed with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. The following 8 weeks were an exercise in silent survival. Esperanza continued her duties with a normality that disconcerted everyone. She did not cry, did not beg, did not show any sign of despair. Don Bernardo watched her with a mixture of admiration and sadness, the servants with a renewed respect that bordered on reverence. Doña Elvira, frustrated by the lack of drama, left for Seville 2 weeks before the process ended. "I will take care of the festivities for your next marriage," she told her son at her farewell. "I already have some candidates in mind, girls from suitable families with wide hips and better prospects." Rodrigo did not reply. The day of Esperanza's departure dawned grey, with low clouds that promised rain. She had packed her belongings in 2 modest trunks: her clothes, her grandmother's locket, a few books, her notes on herbs, nothing from the estate, nothing that could be claimed as belonging to the Mendozas. Don Bernardo waited for her at the door, his eyes moist. "Madam, if you ever need anything, you were one of the only ones who treated me with kindness in this house." She touched his arm. "I will not forget that. And the master, will he not come to say goodbye?" Esperanza looked toward the office window, where a silhouette watched from afar. He has already said all he had to say. The carriage departed under the first drops of rain, taking Esperanza back to the life she had tried to leave behind, back to the village of San Cristobal, back to the family that had sold her like cattle. What she did not know, what no one knew yet, was that she carried with her something beyond 2 trunks and a broken heart, something that would change everything. The new beginning in the ruins. Her parents' house seemed smaller than Esperanza remembered, or perhaps it was she who had grown, not in stature, but in perspective. After 4 years living on the Mendoza estate, the stone hovel where she was born revealed every crack, every leak, every sign of poverty that childhood had disguised with the veil of normality. Don Geronimo Delgado waited for her at the door. Her father was a man life had hardened beyond repair. The years of work under an unforgiving sun had tanned his skin like old leather, and in his eyes there was nothing that could be called paternal warmth, just the cold calculation of one who saw people as tools for survival. "So it is true," he said, as the carriage drove away. "They returned you, father. You were our only hope of escaping misery." His voice was distilled poison. 4 years, eating well and best while we continued in this pigsty. And you could not do the one thing expected of you. Doña Rosario, her mother, appeared in the doorway. She was a woman who seemed to have been emptied from the inside long ago. Her eyes, which perhaps had once shone, now only reflected resignation and a chronic fear that never left her. "Come inside, daughter, it is raining." "She will not stay," Don Geronimo growled. "Not here. Not while she is a cause for shame to this family." "Geronimo." "Silence." He raised his hand, and Doña Rosario flinched like an animal accustomed to being hit. "She can stay in the back room until we arrange something, but I do not want to see that disgraceful face in front of me more than necessary." Esperanza swallowed the words, fighting to escape. It would be pointless to argue. It would be pointless to explain. Her father was a man for whom the only comprehensible language was that of failure and blame, and at that moment, she was the personification of both. The following weeks were an exercise in invisibility. Esperanza rose before dawn, ate her meals alone in the dark kitchen, and spent her days discreetly helping with the chores her mother no longer had the strength to complete. At night, she retreated to the small back room, a space smaller than the closet in her old room at the estate, and read by the light of a candle she needed to conserve. It was on one of those nights, about 3 weeks after her return, that she noticed something strange. Her body was different, her breasts sensitive in a way she did not know, her stomach in constant revolt. And the moon, she counted on her fingers, then counted again, then a third time. The moon had not come for nearly 2 months. Esperanza sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands over her still flat belly, and felt the whole world spin around her. Pregnant. She was pregnant. All those herbs, all those prayers, all those years of frustrated attempts. And now, when there was no marriage, when there was no husband, when there was no hope, now her body finally yielded. The irony was too cruel for tears. For 2 months she kept the secret. She needed to be sure, she needed time to think, to plan, to decide what to do. But her body had other plans. Her belly began to swell. Her nausea became impossible to hide. And one December morning, when she vomited into the bucket of water her mother was carrying, the truth exploded like a summer storm. "Adulteress!" Don Geronimo advanced on her, his face contorted with fury. "First you dishonor us with the return, and now this. Whose bastard is this? Answer." "It is Rodrigo's," Esperanza said, backing against the wall. "It is my husband's. Ex-husband's. And he repudiated you for non-consummation. Do you want me to believe that child is his?" "It is the truth." "Truth?" He spat on the ground. "The truth is that you are a harlot who opened her legs to anyone and now wants to convince me it was the noble Mendoza. No one will believe that. No one." Esperanza looked at her mother, seeking support, but Doña Rosario merely looked away, unable to challenge her husband, even to defend her own daughter. "I will write to him," Esperanza said. "I will tell him about the child. He will laugh in your face. And even if he didn't, do you think I want to be indebted to that man again? That I want to beg for scraps from his table? It is not for you. It is for my son." Don Geronimo came so close she could smell the sour odor of his breath. "You have 3 days to leave this house. There is an abandoned hovel on the outskirts of the village. You can rot there with your bastard. But here, under my roof, you will not stay any longer." "Geronimo," Doña Rosario's voice was a strangled whisper. "She is our daughter. She stopped being my daughter the moment she brought shame upon our name. Esperanza did not argue. She did not beg. She gathered her 2 trunks, put on her warmest coat and prepared to leave. But first she wrote a letter. She addressed it to Rodrigo Mendoza, and in it she poured out the whole truth about the pregnancy, about the circumstances, about the child who was undoubtedly his. She did not beg for pity or demand responsibility. She simply informed him with the same dignity she had maintained throughout the annulment process and asked him to consider what to do with that information. She handed the letter to Andres, her 16-year-old younger brother, the only family member who still looked at her with anything other than contempt. "Will you deliver this personally to Don Rodrigo?" she asked. "It is important." "I promise, sister." The boy's eyes were moist. "And I will continue to visit you. I do not care what our father says." Esperanza kissed his forehead. "You are the only piece of kindness this family produced." The letter arrived at the Mendoza estate 3 days later. Don Bernardo received it from Andres's hands and took it personally to Rodrigo's office. "It is from your former wife, sir. The boy says it is urgent." Rodrigo looked at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake on his desk. Then, in a deliberate movement, he reached out, picked it up, and walked to the fireplace. "Sir, perhaps it would be wise to at least read. There is nothing she can say that will change anything." The flames devoured the paper in seconds. Don Bernardo watched, powerless, as Esperanza's words turned to ash. And on the outskirts of San Cristobal, in an abandoned house that barely withstood the winter wind, a pregnant solitary woman prepared to survive. The healer of the ruined house. The hovel was in a clearing surrounded by oak trees, far enough from the village for the residents to pretend it did not exist. Its stone walls were covered in moss and leaks. The roof let in rain in at least 3 places, and the only furniture was a straw bed eaten by rats and a rickety table that looked ready to collapse. Esperanza spent the first 3 days just making the place habitable. She patched the roof with branches and palm leaves. She covered the cracks in the walls with mud. She burned the straw bed and built another with materials she gathered in the woods. When she finished, her hands were raw and her entire body ached, but the hovel was, at least, a shelter. Survival became her sole occupation. Every morning she woke before dawn and walked to the woods to gather firewood. It was brutal work for a pregnant woman, carrying heavy bundles up steep paths, cutting branches with a rusty axe she found abandoned behind the hovel, dragging everything back in rain or shine. But the firewood could be sold, and the sale of firewood was what kept her alive. The villagers bought it reluctantly, avoiding her eyes and handing over coins as if contact with her were contagious. The divorced woman, they called her, the fallen woman. But they needed firewood, and Esperanza charged less than any woodcutter in the region. It was on one of those working afternoons that she had the idea. She was in the woods, resting with her back against a tree and her hands on the belly that was already beginning to round, when she noticed an abundance of plants around her that she recognized from her grandmother's teachings: wild chamomile growing among the roots, rosemary in the sunniest spots, valerian in the damp areas, arnica on the rocky slopes. Her grandmother used to say that the forest was the pharmacy of the poor. One only needed to know how to read it. That night, Esperanza began to harvest, and in the following weeks, between her trips for firewood, she began to collect herbs, dry them in bundles hung from the hovel's rafters, and transform them into ointments and teas with recipes she knew by heart. The first client was accidental. Dolores, the miller's wife, appeared at the hovel late one afternoon with her small daughter in her arms. The girl had been burning with fever for 3 days, and the village doctor, the only one for leagues around, was traveling. "They said you know herbs," Dolores said, her eyes desperate. "I know I shouldn't be here, I know what they say about you, but my Isabelita—" "Please." Esperanza looked at the child and saw in her the reflection of all the children her grandmother had saved throughout decades of silent practice. "Come in." She worked all night. She prepared elderflower compresses to bring down the fever. She made linden tea to soothe. She applied onion poultices to the girl's chest to relieve congestion, and when the sun rose, the fever had broken, and Isabelita slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "How much do I owe you?" asked Dolores, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "Nothing. You came to me when no one else would. That is worth more than money." Dolores held her hand. "You are not what they say. I will tell everyone." And she did. Little by little, the most desperate villagers began to appear. A mother with a child coughing blood, an elderly man with joint pains that prevented him from working, a young woman with cramps so intense she could barely get out of bed. Esperanza treated everyone, charging only what they could afford, sometimes a coin, sometimes a loaf of bread, sometimes just gratitude. Her reputation grew in the shadows, like a plant that flourishes away from the sun. She was not exactly respected. The mark of fallen woman was too strong for that, but she was tolerated, and in her situation tolerance was almost as valuable as gold. Andres visited her secretly, always bringing something he had pilfered from his parents' pantry, a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, sometimes a bottle of milk. He was the only thread connecting her to her old life, and Esperanza received his visits as small oases in a desert of solitude. "Father asked about you yesterday," he said on one of those visits as winter began to set in. "What did he want to know? If you were still alive?" Andres lowered his eyes. "I think he is remorseful, but he will never admit it. Your father does not know remorse, he knows shame, which is different. He is ashamed to have a daughter who fell into disgrace. But if I died tomorrow, the shame would go away, and he would be relieved." "Sister, it is all right, Andres." She touched his face. "I do not need his forgiveness to survive. I only need myself." And indeed, that was what she was doing, surviving. 8 months pregnant, her body skeletal except for the protruding belly, her hands cracked by work and her face marked by exhaustion, Esperanza continued. She chopped wood, even when she could barely bend down. She prepared medicines, even when she could barely keep her eyes open. And at night, when the cold pierced the hovel's patched walls, she sang the songs her grandmother had taught her to the baby, ancient melodies about the earth and the sea, about the hope that is reborn every spring. "You will be born in a storm," she whispered, her hands on her belly. "I know it, but storms pass, my little one, and after them comes the rainbow." What she did not know was that 2 hours' walk away on the Mendoza lands, another storm was brewing, and that these two storms were about to collide in a way that would change all their destinies forever. Confrontation and revelation. Doña Elvira's carriage arrived at the Mendoza estate, bringing with it the scent of ambition and French lavender. Beside her, dressed in cobalt blue silk that cost more than a worker earned in a year, sat Catalina Montalvo. Catalina was 21 and had the calculated beauty of one who had spent her entire life being prepared to be displayed. Her light brown hair was arranged in elaborate curls that framed a face with delicate features, and her blue eyes had the cold gleam of sapphires, beautiful to look at, but impossible to warm. "Remember what we discussed," Doña Elvira whispered as the carriage entered the estate gates. "Be charming but not eager, elegant but not arrogant, and above all, make him feel that he was the one who chose you." "I know what to do," Catalina replied with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "He is not my first suitor, but he could be your last if you do everything correctly. The Mendoza estate is the largest in the region, and Rodrigo, despite everything, is a malleable man." Doña Elvira did not mention the true reason she had orchestrated the meeting. Don Aurelio Montalvo, Catalina's father, was a merchant with connections at the Spanish court and an ambition as vast as his trade routes. He saw Rodrigo's lands as an opportunity to expand his business, and his daughter as the perfect tool to achieve it. The dowry would be generous, the advantages mutual, and Doña Elvira would receive her commission. Rodrigo waited for them at the entrance to the house, dressed in clothes that were clearly not to his taste, an embroidered coat that Doña Elvira had sent specifically for the occasion, and a silk cravat that seemed to suffocate him. "Mother," he greeted with a formal kiss. "And you must be Miss Montalvo." "Catalina, please." She extended her hand for him to kiss, and there was something studied in each of her gestures. "It is an honor to finally meet you. Your mother cannot stop talking about your achievements." The following days were an elaborate dance of courtship. Catalina displayed all the expected talents of a bride of her class. She played the harpsichord with mastery, spoke fluent French and Italian, embroidered with the precision of an artist, and led conversations about politics and art with an intelligence that impressed. She was, by all metrics of the time, the perfect wife. But Don Bernardo saw what others chose not to see. "She looks at your lands, not you," he told his master one afternoon, after observing Catalina examining the vineyards with the interest of a merchant appraising merchandise. "You see conspiracy in everything, old friend. I see the reality you choose to ignore." Don Bernardo lowered his voice. "She does not love you. She does not even like you, if you want my opinion. What she loves is what you represent. Power, land, position. And is that so different from what all noble marriages are? It was different with Esperanza. The name fell between them like a stone in a still pond. Rodrigo stiffened. Do not speak that name here. Why? Because the truth bothers you? That woman truly loved you, and you discarded her like... Enough. The silence that followed was dense as lead. That same afternoon, Rodrigo witnessed something that planted the first seed of doubt in his heart. He was crossing the corridor that led to the library when he heard voices coming from inside, one clearly Catalina's, the other one of the house's youngest maids. I did not ask for your opinion, creature. Catalina's voice was pure ice. I asked you to bring tea, hot tea. This is lukewarm. I am sorry, madam, Senora Mendoza, that is what you will call me soon. And if I am forced to correct your incompetence again, you will find that I am much less patient than the previous one. Rodrigo walked away before being seen, but the words clung to his mind like thorns. The previous one. That was how Catalina referred to Esperanza. Not by name, not as a person, just as the woman who had occupied the place she now wanted for herself. That night, Rodrigo could not sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his room, remembering another time when another woman had slept by his side, a woman who treated the servants with the same dignity she treated the noble guests, who knew everyone by name, who had turned the cold house of his childhood into a place of warmth and humanity. And he wondered for the first time since the annulment if he had not made a terrible mistake. But the courtship with Catalina continued. The prenuptial agreements were drawn up, involving land transfers and trade agreements that would make the Montalvo family even more powerful. Don Aurelio visited personally to finalize the details, and Rodrigo realized with growing discomfort that he was treated less as a future son-in-law and more as a business partner. The engagement was announced for early October, and it was exactly in early October that destiny decided to intervene in the most brutal way possible. For in a few days, on a dirt road that cut through the woods between the estate and San Cristobal, Rodrigo Mendoza would come across a sight that would shatter all his certainties. And nothing, ever again, would be the same. The woman on the road. The autumn of 1796 arrived painting the oak leaves in shades of rust and gold. The air carried that particular scent of things ending. Grapes harvested, fields reaped, summers saying goodbye. And Rodrigo decided it was the perfect time to show Catalina the extent of his lands. They set off on a clear morning, in an open carriage that allowed them to appreciate the landscape. Catalina wore a moss-green riding habit that highlighted her blue eyes, and she spoke animatedly about the plans she had for the estate, which areas could be expanded, which vineyards were most profitable, which lands could be sold to fund improvements. Rodrigo listened with half an ear, his gaze lost in the olive groves passing by. It was as they crossed the stretch of woods connecting the estate to the main road that he saw her. A woman was walking along the edge of the path, carrying on her shoulders a bundle of firewood so heavy it bent her almost in two. Her dark brown hair, which had once fallen in waves to her waist, was pulled up into a messy bun that revealed a neck too thin, stained with sweat. Her clothes, a simple dress that had seen better days, barely managed to hide the obvious protrusion of her belly. Rodrigo felt his blood run cold. Esperanza. It was Esperanza. She looked up at the exact moment the carriage passed, and for an instant that seemed to last an eternity, their eyes met. In the honey-colored eyes he had known in the happy days of their marriage, there was now something that was not there before, a hardness forged by suffering, an unshakable dignity that made him feel for the first time the true dimension of what he had done. And then she looked away and continued walking, as if he were just another stranger on any road. What a deplorable creature, Catalina commented, fanning herself with her fan as if the air had been contaminated. They should prohibit such people from walking on the main roads. It completely spoils the landscape. Rodrigo did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the figure walking away, making calculations that his mind refused to complete, but that his heart had already finished. 8 months. She was 8 months pregnant. 8 months ago, they were still married. The child was his. The rest of the ride passed in a blur. Rodrigo heard Catalina talk about yields and crops without processing a single word. His mind was stuck on that image. Esperanza skeletal, destroyed, carrying firewood with the weight of her pregnancy, treated by the world as less than human, and he was the one responsible. Upon arriving at the estate, Catalina got out of the carriage and immediately began giving orders to one of the maids who had come out to greet them. Something about the bathwater not being at the right temperature, about the towels not being soft enough, about the general incompetence of the staff. Where did you learn your trade? Catalina's voice was a whip. In a stable? The maid, a young woman named Mercedes who had served the family for years, lowered her head, her eyes moist. I am sorry, madam. Sorry does not fix anything. The next time I have to repeat my instructions, you will find that I know how to be much less patient. Rodrigo watched the scene from the entrance to the house and suddenly saw with absolute clarity what Don Bernardo had tried to show him. He saw the casual cruelty, the innate arrogance, the total absence of humanity that he had confused with refinement. And he also saw the ghost of another woman, one who treated every servant as family, who knew their stories and cared about their problems, who had turned that cold house into a home, a woman he had destroyed. That night, Rodrigo did not attend dinner. He locked himself in his office with a bottle of wine and the letter he had burned months before, or rather, with the memory of it, which now haunted him like a spectre. What had she written? What had she tried to tell him? He already knew the answer, and when the sun rose the next day, Rodrigo Mendoza woke up with a certainty that terrified him more than any debt his father had left, more than any threat of losing his lands, more than any fear he had ever known in his life. He needed to discover the truth. He needed to find Esperanza. He needed to see with his own eyes what his cowardice had created, and he needed to do it before it was too late. The path to atonement. Don Bernardo was in his private office, a modest room at the back of the main house, when Rodrigo entered without knocking. The old administrator looked up from the accounting books and saw something on his master's face that made him stand up immediately. Sir, the letter. Rodrigo's voice was hoarse, as if he had spent the night screaming. The letter she sent me. Do you know what it said? Don Bernardo's silence was answer enough. You knew. Rodrigo took a step forward. This whole time you knew, and you did not tell me anything. I tried to get you to read the letter. You chose to burn it. Then tell me now. Tell me everything. Don Bernardo closed the accounting book with deliberate slowness, giving himself time to choose his words. She is pregnant. The child is yours. Her family threw her out when they found out. She lives in an abandoned hovel on the outskirts of San Cristobal, surviving by cutting firewood and selling herbal remedies. The villagers call her the divorced woman, the fallen woman, the... He paused. Do you want me to continue? Rodrigo sank into a chair as if his legs had given way. Why didn't you tell me? Because you did not want to hear. Because you were so obsessed with heirs and legacies that you forgot what it means to be human. And because, frankly, I had hoped you would discover it yourself and still have time to fix it. Fix it? Rodrigo buried his face in his hands. How do I fix this? That, sir, you will have to discover on your own. An hour later, Rodrigo was riding toward San Cristobal. He had left Catalina at the estate with some excuse about urgent business, ignored his mother's protests about property and decorum, and left before his courage failed him. Finding the hovel was not difficult. He just had to ask the villagers about the healer, and the looks he received in response said more than any directions. There was judgment in those looks, but also something more, a reluctant respect that confused him. The clearing where the hovel was located was small and wild, surrounded by oak trees whose golden leaves formed a crunchy carpet on the ground. The house itself was a patched ruin, with stone walls covered in moss and a roof that seemed to defy gravity. But there were also signs of care, a pile of neatly stacked firewood, pots of herbs in the windows, a curtain made of rustic fabric that gave the place an improbable dignity. Esperanza was sitting on a stone bench beside the door, peeling roots with hands that were once soft and delicate, but which were now calloused and cracked, like those of any worker. She saw him before he had a chance to announce his presence, and in her honey-colored eyes, he found no surprise, just a kind of exhaustion that transcended the physical. You took longer than I expected, she said without getting up. Esperanza. No, her voice was steel. You do not have the right to say my name with that intimacy. Not after everything. I know. He took a step forward, and she stood up abruptly, her protruding belly making the movement awkward. Do not come closer. I just want to talk. Talk? There was something wild in her laugh. You want to talk now? After discarding me like trash? After burning my letter without reading it? After leaving me to survive in the ruins while you planned your new wedding? I did not know. You did not want to know. The words exploded from her, like water from a broken dam. I loved you, Rodrigo. I truly loved you. And you treated me like a sterile mare that was no longer fit for breeding. You humiliated me in front of doctors. ignored me in my own home, let your mother poison me day after day. And when you finally threw me out, you did not even have the decency to say goodbye." Rodrigo stood in silence, absorbing every word like the blows he deserved. "I burned the letter," he said at last. "It was the most cowardly act of my life. It was one of many." "I know. And what do you want now? Forgiveness? Absolution? For me to say it is all right so you can sleep in peace?" "No." He met her eyes and held them. "I want to say that you were right. About everything. I confused the value of things. I exchanged diamonds for glass. And I know that nothing I do will erase what happened." "Then why are you here?" "Because—" He looked at the miserable hovel, at her hands destroyed by work, at the belly carrying his son. "Because I needed to see with my own eyes what my cowardice created. And because, even knowing I do not deserve it, I wanted you to know that I know what I lost, that I know who you are, and that I will never, in my entire life, forgive myself for it." Esperanza stared at him for a long moment, and then, with a voice that was almost soft, "Go away, Rodrigo. Esperanza, you gave up that right when you threw me out, when you burned my letter, when you chose another woman to take my place." She pointed toward the road. "Go back to your lands. Go back to your fiancé. Go back to the life you built on the ruins of mine. And the baby? The baby is mine. Only mine. You gave up on him when you gave up on me." Rodrigo wanted to argue, wanted to protest, wanted to say he had rights, but looking at the woman who had survived what he had done, he realized he had no rights at all, only responsibility. He turned and walked back to his horse. Before mounting, he looked back one last time. "I will fix this," he said. "I do not know how, but I will." "Words," she replied. "That is all you have ever had. Words." And she entered the hovel, closing the door with a finality that echoed through the entire clearing. Rodrigo returned to the estate that night and did something that surprised everyone. He broke off the engagement with Catalina Montalvo. The reaction was nuclear. Catalina screamed, swore, threatened. Doña Elvira fainted, or pretended to faint, on the drawing room sofa, and Don Aurelio Montalvo, when he learned of it, promised to destroy Rodrigo's reputation throughout Spain. "You will regret this," Catalina hissed, as her luggage was carried to the carriage. "I will make everyone know what kind of man you are." "They already know," Rodrigo replied. "The problem is that I am the one who did not know." In the following weeks, rumors spread like fire in dry straw. Don Aurelio carried out his threat, painting Rodrigo as unstable, dishonored, a man who abandoned honorable fiancés for secret lovers. Businesses suffered, neighbors kept their distance, and Doña Elvira returned to Seville, swearing never to speak to her son again. But Rodrigo did not care, for now he had clarity about one thing. He needed to find a way to mend what he had broken, even if it took the rest of his life. The storm and the birth. The storm arrived on the night of November 17th, as if the sky itself were in labor. Lightning cut the horizon in knives of white light, and thunder rolled over San Cristobal with a violence that made the windows rattle. The rain did not fall. It poured down in dense curtains that turned the dirt paths into rivers of mud, and the wind howled through the oak trees like a multitude of lost souls. In Esperanza's hovel, another storm was unfolding. The pains began at nightfall, when the sky was still just a mass of menacing clouds. At first she tried to ignore them. There was work to be done, herbs to prepare, firewood to organize. But when the first true contraction bent her in two, she knew her child had decided to arrive. Dolores, the miller's wife, was present by a chance that seemed like providence. She had come to bring some flour as thanks for Isabelita's cure, and found Esperanza clinging to the table, her face white with pain. "The baby," was all Esperanza could say. Dolores acted with the efficiency of one who had witnessed many births. She sent her eldest son to fetch the village midwife, lit the fire, boiled water, prepared clean cloths. And when the midwife arrived, an elderly woman named Joaquina, who had attended the birth of half of San Cristobal, the expression on her face said everything. "The baby is turned sideways," she announced after examining Esperanza. "Breech position. It will be difficult." Difficult was an understatement. The hours that followed were a labyrinth of pain that Esperanza navigated with clenched teeth and fists gripping the sheets. The storm outside seemed to mirror what was happening in her body, each clap of thunder accompanying a contraction, each flash of lightning illuminating her contorted face. Dolores held her hand. Joaquina worked with fierce concentration, and at some point, Between one wave of pain and the next, Esperanza heard male voices outside. "Tell them to leave," she moaned, "whoever it is." But the voices continued, and then the door opened, and through the haze of suffering, Esperanza saw Rodrigo. He was soaked from head to toe, his black hair plastered to his face, his clothes dripping water onto the dirt floor, and in his eyes there was something she had never seen before, a visceral fear that had nothing to do with lands or heirs. "What are you doing here?" The words came out between clenched teeth. "Andres sent me a message." He was breathless, as if he had run instead of ridden. "About the labor, about complications. Go away." "No." Another contraction swept over her, and Esperanza did not have the strength to argue. "I brought someone," Rodrigo said, and it was then that she noticed another man behind him, older, with a leather satchel in his hands. "Dr. Navarro, the best surgeon in Seville. I rode 3 hours in the storm to fetch him. I did not ask for your help. I know." He knelt beside the bed, ignoring the looks from Dolores and Joaquina. "But I will not let you go through this alone, even if you hate me for the rest of your life." Dr. Navarro was already assessing the situation, his experienced hands confirming what Joaquina already knew. "The lady is right," he told the midwife. "Breech presentation. We need to turn the baby, or?" asked Esperanza. "Or we will have to make an incision." The silence that followed was filled only by the drumming of the rain on the patched roof. The next hour was the longest of Esperanza's life. Dr. Navarro tried to turn the baby manually, a procedure that made her scream with a pain that transcended anything she had known. When that failed, he made the decision they all feared. "I need more light," he said, preparing his instruments. "And someone to hold her." Rodrigo stepped forward before anyone else could offer. He sat behind Esperanza, supporting her against his chest, holding her hands while the doctor worked. She wanted to reject him, wanted to send him away, but the pain was too great, and somewhere beyond the anger and hurt there was a part of her that needed that support. "It will be all right," he whispered in her ear, his trembling voice contradicting the words. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met. You will make it." She did not reply. She just squeezed his hands with a force that would leave marks for days. And then, after an eternity of pain and blood and fear, a cry cut through the air. "It is a boy," Dr. Navarro announced, holding up the small red creature that had bellowed into the world at the height of the storm. "Small, but he seems healthy." Dolores took the baby, cleaned him with soft cloths, wrapped him in a blanket she had brought herself, and when she placed him in Esperanza's arms, the storm outside began to abate, as if the universe could finally breathe. "Sebastian," Esperanza whispered, looking at the crumpled little face that was already seeking her breast. "His name is Sebastian." Rodrigo, still behind her, looked at the son he had never expected to know. And for the first time in years he felt tears run down his face. But the battle was not over. Esperanza had lost a lot of blood. Her skin was pale as wax, her eyes fighting to stay open. "The next 72 hours will be critical," Dr. Navarro said quietly to Rodrigo. "She needs absolute rest, strong nourishment, and someone to care for her constantly." Rodrigo nodded. "I am not leaving here." And he did not. The cost of atonement. For 4 days and 4 nights, Rodrigo Mendoza did not sleep. He sat in a chair beside Esperanza's bed, watching her every breath as if his own life depended on it. When she shivered with cold, he covered her with more blankets. When she sweated with fever, he cooled her forehead with damp cloths. When Sebastian cried from hunger, he handed him over to the care of the wet nurse Dolores had arranged, a cousin of hers who had recently lost a baby and had milk to spare. On the 2nd day, the fever rose dangerously. Esperanza was delirious, muttering disconnected words in her restless sleep, calling for her grandmother, talking to plants, singing fragments of old songs. Rodrigo held her hand through it all, talking to her, even though he knew she probably could not hear him. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "You survived everything I did. You cannot give up now. Sebastian needs you. The world needs you." And quieter, almost inaudible, "I need you." Don Bernardo arrived on the 3rd day, bringing news that Rodrigo barely registered. "Don Aurelio is spreading that you abandoned an honorable fiancée for an adulteress," the old administrator said. "The neighbors are beginning to avoid doing business with us. Let them talk." Rodrigo did not take his eyes off Esperanza. "It does not matter anymore. Sir, the estate can wait." "She cannot." Don Bernardo looked at the scene before him. His master in wrinkled clothes he had not changed for days, with deep dark circles and unshaven, holding the hand of a woman he had discarded months earlier, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You love her," he said, not as a question. Rodrigo took a moment to reply. "I do not know if I have the right to call this love, not after everything, but I know that if she does not survive, a part of me will go with her." On the third night, the fever finally broke. Esperanza opened her eyes on a grey dawn, confused and weak but alive. The first thing she saw was Rodrigo asleep in the chair beside her, Sebastian in his arms, both in deep slumber. For a long moment, she just watched. He was broken, not just physically, that was obvious in the dark circles and pallor, but in some deeper way, as if the shell of arrogance and fear that had always enveloped him had finally cracked, revealing the man who perhaps had always been underneath. Sebastian stirred, and the movement woke Rodrigo. His eyes met hers, and there was a relief in them so intense it seemed almost physical. "You woke up. You stayed. I said I was not going anywhere." Esperanza wanted to reply with anger. She wanted to send him away again, remind him of everything he had done, rebuild the walls he had broken with his constant presence. But she was too exhausted to fight. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because it was the least I could do. Because you deserved someone by your side, even if that someone was the last person you wanted to see. And because," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "because I needed to prove to myself that I am capable of being more than I was. That does not change anything. I know. I still do not trust you. I know that too. And I will not forgive you just because you sat in a chair for a few days. I am not asking for forgiveness." He stood up, holding Sebastian against his chest with surprising care. "I am asking for a chance to show who I can be. Not as a husband, not as a father, not as anything you do not want me to be. Just as someone who wants to help. No conditions, no expectations." Esperanza closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion weigh on her like a lead blanket. "Go away, Rodrigo. Go away now." She opened her eyes again. "Not because I want you to, but because I need to think. I need to recover. I need to figure out what to do with all this." He nodded slowly. "I will leave Sebastian with the wet nurse, and I will send someone to look after you. I do not need—" "Please." There was something pleading in his voice that made her hesitate. "Let me do at least this. Afterward, if you want me to disappear forever, I will disappear." Esperanza considered for a moment. "1 week," she said at last. "Give me 1 week, then we will talk." "1 week," he repeated. "I will be here." And he left, taking the warmth of his presence with him, and leaving behind a silence that, for the first time in a long time, did not seem entirely hostile. The long road to forgiveness. 1 week turned into 2. 2 weeks turned into a month. And when December arrived, covering the fields with frost, Rodrigo Mendoza had become a constant presence on the outskirts of San Cristobal. He did not live in the hovel. That would be unthinkable, both for Esperanza's reputation and for his own sanity. Instead, he rented a room in the village's only inn and established a routine that the villagers first found strange, then tolerated, and finally accepted as another eccentricity of the rich. Every morning he arrived at the hovel carrying provisions, firewood already cut, so Esperanza would not have to work, fresh food from the market, new blankets for the approaching winter, medicines that Dr. Navarro had prescribed for her recovery. In the beginning, she refused almost everything. "I do not want your charity," she would say, pushing the packages back into his hands. "It is not charity. It is responsibility. I survived alone for months. I can continue surviving. I know you can, but you do not have to." Little by little, Esperanza's resistance began to give way. Not because she trusted him, but because practicality spoke louder than pride. The winter was brutal. Sebastian needed warmth, and she had not fully recovered her strength. Rodrigo never demanded anything in return. He never tried to touch her, never hinted at any romantic expectation, never spoke about the future. He simply showed up, did what needed to be done, and left when he felt his presence was becoming a burden. It was Don Bernardo who first noticed the change. "You are different, sir," he said on one of his visits to bring news from the estate. "Different how?" "Before you worked to build something. Now you work to mend something. It is a different energy. More humble, if I may say so." Rodrigo considered the words. "When I look at her, at what she became, at what I made of her," he paused, "I spent my whole life afraid of becoming my father, afraid of losing everything as he did. And in the process, I became something worse. He was weak. I was cruel. And now I want to be strong enough to admit when I am wrong, and patient enough to wait for her to let me try to mend. The villagers, initially hostile due to the rumors Don Aurelio had spread, began to revise their opinions. They saw Rodrigo arrive every day, saw him carry wood and water like any common worker, saw him sit on the stone bench outside the hovel and talk to Esperanza about herbs and plants, while Sebastian slept in his lap. It was not the behavior of a man who had abandoned a fiancée for a mistress. It was the behavior of someone trying to repair a mistake. Esperanza observed all this with a caution that refused to yield completely. She had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, that words were cheap, that men could change direction as quickly as the wind. But there was also, buried beneath layers of hurt, a recognition that this Rodrigo was different from the man who had thrown her out. This Rodrigo did not talk about heirs or legacies. He did not treat her as a womb to be filled. When he looked at Sebastian, there was genuine love in his eyes. Not the self-interested love of one who sees a continuation of lineage, but the simple love of a father for his son. And when he looked at her, Esperanza did not want to name what she saw there. Not yet. "You can repair the roof," she said one January morning, when a particularly violent storm revealed leaks she could not fix alone. Rodrigo looked up, surprised. It was the first time she had asked for something. "Of course, I will bring materials tomorrow. And perhaps," she hesitated, "perhaps you could do something about the east wall. It is giving way. I will call a stonemason." "No," she met his eyes. "You. If you are going to do it, let it be you." He understood. It was not about the work itself. It was about proving he was willing to do more than just pay for solutions. In the following week, Rodrigo worked alongside workers he himself hired, carrying stones and mixing mortar, until the hovel became something that could legitimately be called a home. He added a room for Sebastian, installed a real fireplace, built a fence for the herbs Esperanza cultivated, and at no point did he ask for recognition or thanks. When February arrived, bringing the first signs that winter was beginning to yield, Esperanza finally did what she had been postponing for weeks. She invited him to dinner. It was not a romantic dinner. Dolores was present, as was the wet nurse, but it was a dinner at her table, with food she had prepared, sharing the warmth of a house he had helped build. And when the night ended and he stood up to leave, she said something that made him freeze mid-step. "Thank you." 2 simple words, but loaded with a weight they both understood. "You do not need to thank me," he replied. "I know, but I wanted to say it anyway." Rodrigo nodded and walked out into the cold night. And as he walked back to the inn, he allowed himself for the first time in months to feel something he had forgotten how to name: hope. A new vow. February 1797 brought a thaw not only to the fields of San Cristobal, but also to the heart of Esperanza Delgado. Sebastian was 3 months old and already showing signs of his parents' temperament, his father's grey-green eyes, his mother's dark hair, and a stubbornness that seemed to belong to both in equal measure. Esperanza spent hours watching him, marveling at the perfect creature they had created together amidst so much chaos. One afternoon of weak sun, while Sebastian slept in his cradle and Rodrigo repaired one of the windows the winter had damaged, Esperanza sat on the stone bench and said the words they both knew would eventually come. "We need to talk." Rodrigo put down his tools and came to sit beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I am listening. These months," she searched for the right words, "you have been different from the man I knew, the man I married, the man who discarded me. I see the change. I cannot deny it. But I cannot forget." Her eyes met his, and there was a raw honesty in them that cut through him. "Every time I look at you, I remember the nights I spent alone in that bed while you slept in the next room. I remember the doctors examining me as if I were defective livestock. I remember your mother treating me as an intruder in my own home. And I remember the day you sent me away with 2 trunks and a lie." Rodrigo swallowed hard. "I know. And I know that no amount of work or presence will erase that." "It will not." She paused. "But I also do not want to spend the rest of my life carrying that weight. Hatred consumes me, Rodrigo. It corrodes me inside like rust, and I refuse to let what you did define who I am." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I forgive you." The words fell between them like stones in a pond, creating ripples that expanded in all directions. "Not because you deserve it," she continued. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I deserve to move on. Because Sebastian deserves a mother who is not poisoned by bitterness. And because," she hesitated, "because I need to believe that people can change." that mistakes do not have to define us forever. Rodrigo felt tears burning his eyes. Esperanza, no, let me finish. She raised her hand. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and it definitely does not mean we go back to what we were. If you want to be part of my life, of Sebastian's life, we need to start from scratch, as strangers. Strangers? You need to know me as I am now, not as the wife you rejected, not as the mother of your heir, but as Esperanza, the woman who survived, who built a life from nothing, who learned to stand on her own. And you will know me too? I will try. There was almost a smile on her lips. I will try to see the man you are becoming, not the man you were. But that will take time, and patience, and the understanding that at any moment if I feel you are reverting to who you were, I will leave. And this time, you will never find us again. Rodrigo nodded, the tears finally running down his face. I accept everything, even if it takes years, even if it takes a lifetime. Esperanza extended her hand, not for a handshake, not for a romantic touch, but for something in between. A bridge over an abyss that still needed to be crossed. Rodrigo held it gently, as if it were made of glass. And there, on that stone bench of a patched-up hovel on the outskirts of a forgotten village, two broken hearts began the long and uncertain process of healing. A lifetime of mending. The months that followed were a delicate dance between two worlds trying to reconnect. Rodrigo returned to managing the estate, but his visits to San Cristobal remained constant. He came 3 times a week, sometimes more, and each visit was a small conquest. A smile coaxed from Esperanza with a silly joke, a shared moment of silence as they watched Sebastian discover the world around him, a conversation that stretched into the night about things they had never discussed before. For the first time in their years together, they truly talked. My father was a good man before he lost himself in gambling, Rodrigo recounted one spring night, as the fire crackled in the hovel's yard. I remember him carrying me on his shoulders through the olive groves, teaching me to recognize when the olives were ripe. But after he started losing, it was as if someone else had taken his place. A stranger wearing my father's face, and you were afraid of becoming him. I was afraid of everything he represented. Failure, shame, loss. He paused. I spent so many years trying not to be him that I forgot to discover who I truly wanted to be. And who do you want to be? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Someone my son can look up to. Someone you can respect. Esperanza in turn shared stories of her grandmother, the woman who had taught her about herbs, about the strength of women, about the dignity that no one can take from you because it was given to you by no one. She told me that the most resilient plants are those that grow in rocky ground, Esperanza said on one of those nights. That adversity does not break us, it strengthens us. I did not understand at the time. I thought it was just something old people say to comfort the young. And now I know she was right. Everything I went through. She looked at the hovel that was once a ruin and was now a home. All of it transformed me into someone I would not be otherwise. Someone stronger, more aware, more me. The friendship that grew between them was different from anything they had before. There was no pressure of the arranged marriage, the expectation of heirs, the weight of appearances. There were just two people getting to know each other for real for the first time. And then, almost without them noticing, the friendship began to turn into something more. It was in a small gesture that Esperanza first noticed, the way her fingers brushed Rodrigo's when he handed her a cup of tea. It was in a glance that lasted a second too long. It was in the longing she felt when he left, and the joy she could not hide when he arrived. In the autumn of 1797, when Sebastian began to take his first tottering steps, Esperanza accepted Rodrigo's invitation to visit the estate. The Mendoza estate was different from how she remembered it. Not in the structures, the olive groves were the same, the main house still imposing, but in the atmosphere. There was less rigidity, less formality. The workers greeted Rodrigo by name, and he knew their names in return. You changed things, she observed as they walked through the fields. I tried. After everything, I realized that the estate was not a legacy to be protected, but a community to be cultivated. These people depend on me, yes, but I also depend on them. Esperanza began to treat the sick on the estate during these visits. The workers, who at first looked at her with the same suspicion as the villagers of San Cristobal, soon began to seek her out for consultations. She treated their fevers, prepared ointments for their pains, advised mothers on baby care. And little by little, without anyone needing to announce it, she began to be seen as the lady of the estate again, not by position, but by presence. It was on Sebastian's first birthday, at an intimate celebration at the hovel with Dolores, Don Bernardo, and Esperanza's mother, who had finally found the courage to defy her husband and re-establish contact with her daughter, that Rodrigo asked the question they both knew would come. There was no kneeling. There was no elaborate ring. There were just two people sitting side by side on a stone bench, watching their son play with dried leaves in the yard. "Marry me," he said simply, "not as before, not for arrangement or convenience, but because I love you, because you made me a better person, and because I can no longer imagine my life without you." Esperanza did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch as she processed everything that moment meant. "I have one condition," she said at last. "Anything. Never pretend the past did not exist. Never sweep what happened between us under the rug. Sebastian will grow up, and one day he will ask about our story, and I want him to know the truth, all of it, including the ugly parts." Rodrigo considered for a moment. "Why?" "Because truth is the only foundation on which we can build something that lasts. And because I want our son to know that love is not the absence of mistakes, but the ability to mend what was broken. Then he will know," said Rodrigo. "He will know everything. And if that means he judges me, that he condemns me, then I will accept it, because it is what I deserve." Esperanza finally smiled, a true smile, the first he had seen on her face since the happy days of their first marriage. "Then yes, I will marry you." And when he kissed her there in the golden light of the late afternoon, with Sebastian's laughter in the background and the silent testimony of everyone who loved them, something that had been broken finally began to feel whole. The legacy of the curandera. The ceremony took place in December 1797, in the same church of San Cristobal, where, almost 5 years earlier, two strangers had joined by convenience. This time, everything was different. Esperanza's dress was not inherited from anyone. She had sewn it herself, with simple fabric and wildflower embroidery that resembled her herb garden. Her hair was down, falling in brown waves to her waist, and on her neck she wore the same silver locket from her grandmother, now with a new addition, a lock of Sebastian's hair so that the future and the past would always remain together. Rodrigo waited for her at the altar, his eyes moist. He wore simple clothes he had chosen himself, without interference from his mother, who, true to her word, had refused to attend. By his side, Don Bernardo held Sebastian, whose grey-green eyes observed everything with the insatiable curiosity of his 13 months of life. The pews were occupied by those who truly mattered, Dolores and her family, the wet nurse who had saved Sebastian's life in the early days, the estate workers who had witnessed Rodrigo's transformation, and in the front row with tears in her eyes, Doña Rosario, Esperanza's mother, who had finally found the courage she had lacked her entire life. There were no illustrious crowds. There were no nobles from Seville. There was no ostentation or pomp. There was only love. "Are you sure this is what you want?" asked the priest, a young replacement for the old Father Alfonso. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Esperanza replied. The vows they exchanged were not the traditional ones. Esperanza had refused prepared formulas, insisting that every word should come from the heart. "I promise," Rodrigo said, his voice trembling with emotion, "never again to confuse what you are with what you can give me. I promise to listen when you speak, to see when you are present, and to cherish every day you choose to spend by my side. I promise to be the man you deserve, even on the days I fail. And I promise that our story, all of it with its wounds and its cures, will be told honestly to all who come after us." Esperanza held his hands tightly. "I promise," she said, "to believe in change, even when doubt whispers in my ears. I promise to build a life with you that is not about names or lands, but about love and purpose. I promise to be patient when you waver, firm when you need support, and honest even when the truth is difficult. And I promise that no matter what comes, we will face it together, because together we are stronger than we ever were alone." When the priest declared them married, Sebastian let out a little shriek that made the entire church laugh. Rodrigo took him into his arms, and there stood the three of them, a family born from ruins and rising stronger because of them. The celebration that followed was simple and joyful, with guitar music and food that the estate workers prepared with care. Esperanza danced with Rodrigo under the stars, then with Don Bernardo, who wept while saying it was the happiest day of his 60-something years. The next morning, they left for the estate. Not for the main house, that would come later, but for the east wing that Rodrigo had had completely renovated, creating a space that was theirs and no one else's. And Esperanza brought her mother with her, who would finally have a home where she could live without fear. The following years were the happiest any of them had known. Esperanza became a lady of the estate, unlike any who preceded her. She established a small infirmary on the property, where she treated workers and villagers who could not afford doctors. Her knowledge of herbs, which was once her only means of survival, became a service that benefited hundreds. The infirmary grew, gained a reputation, and people came from distant villages in search of the curandera Mendoza, the healer Mendoza. Rodrigo worked alongside her in everything. They were no longer master and lady of the estate in the traditional way. They were partners, collaborators, each complementing what the other lacked. He learned to listen. She learned to trust. And in the inevitable discussions that arose, they resolved everything through dialogue, never again with silence. In 1799, Leonor was born, a girl with her mother's honey-colored eyes and her father's determined temperament. In 1801, Raphael arrived, a quiet, contemplative boy who preferred books to play. In 1803 came Clara, the youngest, who inherited the easy laughter of Dolores, her godmother. Sebastian grew up knowing the whole truth about how his family had begun. At the age of 10, on a summer night, Rodrigo sat with him under the estate's oldest olive tree and told him everything: the arrangement, the rejection, the burned letter, the encounter on the road. "You made Mama suffer," the boy said when the story ended, his eyes too serious for his age. "I did, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But you changed. I tried. I still try, every day." Sebastian was silent for a moment, processing everything. "Mama says that true character is not never falling, but how you get up. She is right, as always. Then I think you have good character, father." The boy held his hand. "Because you fell very deep, but you got up." Rodrigo embraced his son with tears in his eyes, silently grateful for a second chance he never deserved, but had striven to honor. The hovel where Esperanza had almost lost everything was transformed into a grain storehouse for the poor of San Cristobal, a permanent reminder that even the most desolate places can become sources of hope. And the estate infirmary expanded over the decades, becoming a reference throughout the region. The years passed as they pass for everyone, with joys and sorrows, achievements and losses, the inevitable tapestry of human life. Don Bernardo departed serenely at 70, surrounded by the family he had helped rebuild. Doña Rosario lived to an old age, always by the side of the daughter she had once lacked the courage to defend. And even Doña Elvira, years later, sent a letter of reconciliation that Rodrigo accepted with more compassion than she deserved. In the autumn of his 76th year, Rodrigo sat for the last time under the centuries-old olive tree, with Esperanza by his side, as she had always been. Their children and grandchildren played in the distance, their laughter echoing across the fields he had dedicated a life to cultivating. "Thank you," he said, his voice already weak but still filled with love. "For what? For giving me more than I deserved, for teaching me that true love is not the absence of mistakes, but the presence of forgiveness, for transforming a lost man into someone worth remembering." Esperanza held his hand with the same firmness as always. "You transformed yourself. I merely gave you the chance. And you?" He turned to face her, his eyes still green despite all the time. "What are you most proud of?" She thought for a moment, looking at the fields, at the home they built together, at the children they raised, at the grandchildren who would run through those lands long after they had both departed. "Of having survived," she said at last, "and of having chosen to love again, even when love seemed the most dangerous thing in the world." Rodrigo smiled, that smile she had learned to love over decades. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met, and you are the most stubborn man. A good pair, then. The best." And they remained that way, hand in hand under the olive tree that had witnessed their entire story, until the sun set over the golden fields of the Mendoza estate, and the first stars began to dot the sky. Rodrigo departed serenely days later, surrounded by everyone he loved. His last words, whispered in Esperanza's ear, were simple: "You gave me more than I deserved. Thank you for teaching me to be worthy of it." Esperanza lived for a few more years, passing on her wisdom to the new generations, looking after her infirmary, telling her family's story to anyone who would listen. She departed at 73 in peace, certain that the seed she had planted would continue to flourish long after she was gone. They were buried together under the centuries-old olive tree, where so many important conversations had taken place. On their gravestones they had the words engraved that summarized who they were: Esperanza Delgado de Mendoza, wife, mother, healer, proof that grace transforms; Rodrigo Mendoza, husband, father, testimony that the lost can find their way. And on nights of the full moon, the residents of San Cristobal say, it is still possible to hear the wind in the olive trees, whispering a truth that Esperanza had known all along. That true love is not the one that never breaks. It is the one that once broken chooses to be mended, and that the mends, when done with care, make the thing stronger than it was before. The true legacy is not what we leave in the earth, but what we plant in hearts.